From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
How many, I'm talking only to people under the age of about 14. How many of you have been to book festivals before? My grandsons. So a good many of you, huh? How many of you are here from out of town? Aha. Well, that's great. Did you come? He is or is not? Okay. Did you come especially for the book festival? Yes? That's great. Well, that's very exciting. Of course, this is, as you know, the first year that we've had it inside. And we weren't sure who was going to show up. So we're very glad that you came. And we're particularly glad for the kids who came. I'm now hearing that it is likely that Dr. Billington is not going to get here, which I'm very sorry about because he is such a special person, but I'm a little bit glad about because it means I have more time to talk to you. So I'm Cokie Roberts, and I am thrilled that you all have come to hear about these fabulous people that I've been writing about all of these years. But again, I want to talk to the kids and ask them, you know, in all the pictures that you see, when you're looking at history books or kids who live here in Washington, when you go maybe to the archives or something like that, and you look at those pictures of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, is anything missing in those pictures? Huh? Does anybody know? All right, go ahead, Roland. What's missing? Women. Women. There are no women in those pictures. Now, do you think there were women then? Seriously. Do you think there were? Yes? How come? How do you know there were women then? How do we know there were women then? There's no evidence. There's absolutely no evidence that there were women then. So how do we know they existed? Can any kid answer that question? Huh? Huh? Yes? Good. Seriously. Do I see a hand somewhere? Yes, go ahead. There are men, that is the evidence. Absolutely correct. If there were not women, there wouldn't be men. But very good. But the truth is, there's no way of knowing that in reading our history books. There's no way of knowing that in looking at our pictures of our country in the past. And it's a terrible omission. Omission, you know what that means? What's it mean? Something left out. So it was left out. And I thought that was a terrible problem because I know, having been somebody who spends a lot of time writing about current politics, that it had to be true that women were involved back in the past. So I started doing the work about it, and I discovered that, boy, were they ever. And they were very, very, very involved. And, you know, at that time of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, when we see all of those pictures of the men, the truth is that the men took forever to decide to declare independence. They were having big arguments. They were talking and talking in the Congress. And the women, especially one woman, whose name was Abigail Adams. Does anybody know who her husband was? Very good. John Adams, says Vivian, age 5. Abigail Adams kept writing to John and saying, for heaven's sakes, declare independence. What's wrong with you, lily-livered men? That you were afraid of the British? What's the problem? Well, of course, the reason she really understood about that was because she was home by herself in Massachusetts. Well, not by herself. She had 4 little children. and you know, some of the older relatives and all of that. And John would write to her and say, you know, oh, you're doing very well there all by yourself. But she was trying to manage the farm and take care of the kids and take care of the old people. And oh, by the way, the British were coming. And so John wrote to her at one point, and it said, if it gets really dangerous, take our children and fly to the woods. Thank you, John. I hope you're having a nice dinner in Philadelphia, would have been my reply. Well, she was in great danger, and as her son, whose name was what? Anybody know what Abigail Adams? John Quincy Adams. And what did he become? President. And he wrote years later, for the space of 12 months, my mother, with her infant children, dwelt liable every hour of the day and night to be butchered in cold blood and taken and carried to Boston as hostages. So she was in great danger, but she was still very, very brave. And all she wanted was for John to get the other men in Congress and get their act together and declare independence. Well, at that same time, as the build up to the war, before it was really fully a revolutionary war, there was another American that you hear everything about without hearing about the women, and that's a man named Benjamin Franklin. Now, can anybody tell me what Benjamin Franklin did? Any hands up? Yes, go ahead. He discovered that lightning made electricity. That's true. Anybody, anything else? Anything else? A grown-up. Does a grown-up want to answer this one? Because this seems to be more our age than the kids. Go ahead. He did sign the Declaration. He actually helped write the Declaration. But anything else? Go ahead, Jack. He was ambassador to France, yes. There you go. First Postmaster General. For some reason, that doesn't seem to get communicated to the younger generation. But the truth is, Benjamin Franklin was in England. He was not here to be the Postmaster General. He was in England for 12 years. So he couldn't be running the Postal Service. Deborah Franklin ran the Postal Service. And in fact, she did a terrific job of it. And at one point, the British lord, who was in charge of her, tried to fire one of her workers. And she said, "You're not going to do that. And by the way, you're being very rude to me." And when you see the book on page 13, you see Deborah holding Lord Loudon in the palm of her hand and looking very, very angry at him. It's one of the many fabulous illustrations that Diane Good, the Caldecott-winning illustrator, did here. But so she was a very fine businesswoman, and Franklin always thanked her for her taking care of the business. But she kept wanting him to come home, and their only daughter got married, and still he wouldn't come home. And he just said, "Keep the wedding cheap." And then the British passed the Stamp Act. Anybody remember what the Stamp Act was? Well, it was a tax on all kinds of things that the Americans liked, and we were furious with the British for passing it. And they thought that Franklin had not been against it enough, that he had not opposed it sufficiently. So his neighbors were ready to burn down his house because they were so angry with him. But Deborah said, that's not how. Everybody said, "Deborah, you have to run, you have to run. They're going to burn down your house." And she said, "I'm not doing that. It's my house." So instead, she got a gun, and she got some relatives, and she kept the house from being burned down. And there's the illustration of that and what she said about it. And Ben wrote to her and said, "Well done, Deborah." But still he didn't come home. And finally she died. and he came home and said he had to because my wife, in whose hands I had left all my affairs, has died. So poor Ben had to come home. Now, I will give him, he got home and he did help write the Declaration of Independence. And then he went to France and helped forge the alliance that won the war. So he wasn't all bad. But finally, of course, these men did write that declaration. And war was really on. And of course, George Washington was our first general. And Martha Washington, now when I was growing up, one of the few things I did learn about the women was that Martha spent a winter with George where? Does anybody remember? Somebody else? Yeah, go ahead. Valley Forge. But the truth is she spent every winter of the 8 long years of the Revolutionary War at camp with the soldiers. And she found it very, very frightening at first. She said, I heard every gun that started and ended the battles. But she got very used to it, and George insisted that she come because he thought she was very, very important to troop morale, that she and the other generals or their officers' wives would make such a difference because there were times when the soldiers weren't paid, they didn't have any clothes, they didn't have any place to live, and they were threatening to leave the army in huge groups by regiment. And so it was very important to have these women there to cook for them and sew for them and pray with them and nurse them and put on great entertainments for them to keep up their morale and keep their spirits high so they'd stay in the army. And it was probably good that Martha Washington was there because George Washington sometimes could do things that he probably shouldn't have done, like dance for 3 hours straight with the really beautiful and flirty Catherine Littlefield Greene. So it was good that Martha was on hand. Well, the first winter that Washington was at camp in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the soldiers all lived in the Harvard dormitories, everybody wanted to come see him, come meet General Washington and Lady Washington. And one of the people who came to see him was a writer named Mercy Otis Warren, who was one of the great propagandists for the Revolution. Her writings were as important as Thomas Paine writing Common Sense and all of that to gin up opposition to the British. And so she went to see General Washington, and she wrote about him that she thought that he was amiable and accomplished. But General Charles Lee, who was also there, she said, well, though she found him sensible and judicious, she also thought he was marked by ugliness and unpoliteness. So she didn't expect us to be reading her mail 200 years later. And that is, of course, how we learn this history. We read their mail, we read their diaries. It's okay, they're dead. And we are able to piece together this missing history that we have of the women. And she, Mercy Otis Warren, also wrote a very important history of the Revolution, which has things in it that the men's histories do not have, about the effects of war on women and the use of certain things in battle. And it's quite a significant work still today. Well, another person that Washington actually invited to come see him at camp was a poet named Phyllis Wheatley. And her story is absolutely remarkable. I know a lot of you kids know this story, and I'm thrilled that that's true. So she was a young African girl. She was kidnapped as part of the slave trade and brought to Boston. One of the things that people forget is that there were slaves. The sin of slavery, as Abigail Adams so aptly described it, was in every colony before the war. And Phyllis Wheatley was brought to Boston. We think she was about 8 years old. Does anybody know how we know how old she was? Because she still had her baby teeth. And she went to live with a family called the Wheatleys. And they understood how smart she was. And the teenagers in the family taught her to read and write, and then she was quickly learning Latin and Greek, and then she was writing poetry. And nobody could believe that this young slave girl was this poet. And she tried to get her poetry published, and nobody believed her. So finally, all the important men in Boston wrote letters saying, really, she did this. And they sent them off with her poems to England. And the book was published, and she became this huge international celebrity. And so Washington wanted to meet her. By that time, of course, the Wheatleys had finally given her freedom. Well, the war went on for 8 very long years. And there were times when it looked like we might not be winning. And the women of the country understood at one point that the danger of the soldiers departing was really great. And so they put on a fundraising drive. And in the space of just about 3 weeks, in 1780, they raised $380,000 and used it to increase morale for the troops. The woman who organized that, Esther de Burt Reed, had a big fight with George Washington about how to spend the money. She wanted it to be something special for the troops, maybe some hard currency. And Washington said, "Are you crazy? They'll use it to drink." And he said, "What they need is shirts." And she said, "Well, but you're supposed to get them shirts." And so they fought back and forth. Well, Washington was the general, and he won, and Esther died. And so they made them all shirts, but for the women to show the soldiers how special the soldiers were to them, every woman embroidered her own name onto the shirt she made. So the soldier knew that someone cared about him. And it was huge in terms of keeping the army together until the French arrived and helped save the war. And then the war was over, and we had a country to raise. And that became an even harder proposition. But we had in Washington, through those years, someone who was incredibly important to keeping the country together. And that was, of course, Dolly Madison. And we have just commemorated here the 200th anniversary of the burning of Washington, when the British came in and attacked the city in the War of 1812. And Dolly Madison famously saved George Washington's portrait. But she had also prepared a meal for the cabinet and President Madison's top officers. British came in, they sat down, they burned the Capitol, they marched to the White House, they sat down, they ate Dolly's meal, kind of like Goldilocks, and then they burned the White House. And since they didn't have George Washington's portrait to steal, they stole Dolly Madison's portrait. But she came back a few days later and argued to keep the Capitol in Washington, and so it was still here. So there are a lot of wonderful stories of very brave women, and they're wonderful, wonderful illustrations. I have to tell you, I loved getting to know them, and I love all of the things that they did. But the best compliment to them did not come from any of the Americans who did compliment them, but came from the enemy, from the British. Lord Cornwallis, the leader of the British, said in the middle of the war, "We may destroy all the men in America, and we should still have all we can do to defeat the women." So these are our founding mothers. We just have time for a couple of questions, unfortunately, but there are some microphones, I'm told. And if anybody has a question, I'd be delighted to answer them as long as we have time. Questions? Any of you kids have a question? Vivian, do you have any questions? No? Roland, you have
I know it's hard to choose, but of all the women in your book, who is your favorite?
I get that question a lot, and the answer is I don't have a favorite because they're different in different ways. So I think that Mercy Otis Warren was a great thinker, although I don't think she was a very nice person. I think that Abigail Adams was a fascinating person. But the person I know that I would like to have dinner with is my newfound just met friend, Vivian's favorite, who is Sarah Livingston Jay, the wife of John Jay, who was our first Chief Justice. But she was a Livingston of a family of 5 great daughters. And her mail is just so humorous and so delightful that I know that she'd be a whole lot of fun to sit down with at dinner. And we have some of her menus. She also served good food. That's another way we get to know this history, by the way, is to look at menus. In the grown-up version of Founding Mothers and its sequel, Ladies of Liberty, I have recipes at the back because I think it's a point of connection with these women from our past. It's a place we can recognize them so easily. So, yes.
I do have one.
Can you talk into the mic? Yeah.
We use your books and in our U.S. history
Excellent.
class. And they're great introductions, and the teachers love them. Do you plan to continue writing along this thread, and what do you have next coming up?
I'm glad you asked. I am currently writing a book on how the Civil War changed women's lives, focused on the political women here in Washington. And it's fascinating. It's got all the same ingredients as World War II. I mean, there were government girls. There was the equivalent of Rosie the Riveter in the arsenals. There were women who rose to deal with the issues, African American women dealing with the question of contraband, and the political women who had described themselves as belles. That's how they talked about themselves. Going from they were always political, but they were at dances and receptions and such. And they became suffragists and writers and social workers and organizers. So it became a tremendous change in their lives. And the advantage to that period of history is that I can actually go online, thanks to the Library of Congress, and read newspapers from that period. And that's a huge advantage in terms of giving it specificity. It's a huge disadvantage because I get so interested that it's really hard to write. I'm just reading the newspaper. Anything else?
I recently found out that Washington used women spies. One of them supposedly stopped Benedict Arnold from his plot against the West Point. You want to address those?
Women spies are very much, I was going quickly here, and we do have in this children's book even a wonderful Diane Good, who, as I say, was just a fabulous, fabulous illustrator. At the very end, in fact, she said to me, she got so interested in their writing, their handwriting, that she said to me, do you think we could find all of their signatures? So under each woman's picture is actually the way she signed her name, and that was quite something to find. But we have these interludes of women writers and women warriors, and I do talk about the spies in here, and in the big book talk about them a great deal. They were quite something. Spying became women's work for obvious reasons. And one of them, who I have in here, Emily Geiger, was delivering a message to General Greene, and the British stopped her, and they said, "Oh, wait, we have to find a woman to search you," sort of like TSA, and so she quickly, while they went out to find a woman, read the message, memorized it, swallowed it, and so when the British came in to search her, there was no message. And she then, even knowing how incredibly dangerous it was, then continued on and delivered the message to Greene. In terms of Benedict Arnold, his wife was a spy for the British. and she was in it from the beginning. She actually sort of ginned him up to it. And she literally wrote between the lines of letters with invisible ink to Major Andre to tell them what American troop movements were and all of that. But the historians did not believe Washington didn't believe it, Lafayette didn't believe it, Hamilton didn't believe it because she was really pretty. And the historians didn't believe it, and even though the British had given her a pension for the services she had rendered until they finally opened the papers in the 1950s. So, yeah. One more over there.
I know Martha Washington destroyed, I think, all of her mail. So where do you find your research for Martha Washington?
Yeah, I'm really upset with Martha Washington. I mean, could I'd kill her again. Although I'm a great admirer of hers, and I spend a lot of time at Mount Vernon because they do wonderful, wonderful teacher programs. But every time I'm there, I get mad at them because it says George Washington's Mount Vernon. And I say, really? You know, I mean, he did this all by himself. But she destroyed most of her mail with George, but there are other letters, and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has been wonderful in finding them, about her and to her, and her letters to people other than George also, several of them still exist. So that's really how you get most of the information on her. Thomas Jefferson destroyed his correspondence with his wife, saying that he was heartbroken and had to destroy it. I don't think that's what you do when you're heartbroken, but it's his story and he's sticking to it. And James Monroe appears to have destroyed all of his correspondence with his wife. So there's certain people we really do have to find and piece together in other ways. Thankfully, Abigail Adams wrote thousands and thousands of letters, and now all of her letters to John Adams and his to her are online at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So that's a huge benefit. So, but the women's letters, let me just say this in closing, because it's something to think about in terms of your own households. The women's letters are really different from the men's letters. The men, particularly in this founding period, knew that they were doing something extraordinary. They were very self-aware. And so they knew if they succeeded that their letters would be preserved and published. And so they wrote with that in mind, and they wrote very self-consciously and often very pompously. The women just wrote. And so in one letter you can get, we need to declare war on France, and I need that hat back from my bedroom, can you send it to me? And Elizabeth has just had and lost a baby, and food prices are very high. And so you can get a whole sense of the society through the women's letters. And if you look around your own homes, you're likely to find some. So do that. I'm getting the hook. It's been wonderful, wonderful to be with you. Thank you so very much for joining me. Appreciate it.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.